The number was 1,200. That's how many objects were cataloged in a single warehouse in Chicago in 1893, then quietly removed from public record within 18 months. Not lost. Removed. I didn't go looking for a conspiracy. I went looking for a catalog entry that didn't match the exhibit it was supposed to describe, and what I found instead was a paper trail that keeps ending in ash. Let me be honest with you. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scientist. I'm someone who reads too many archive files in the middle of the night and notices when the numbers don't add up. And right now, the numbers aren't adding up at all. Because here is what mainstream history asks you to believe. That for most of human civilization, prior to the Industrial Revolution, people were essentially helpless before the natural world. Dying at 40, hauling water by hand, burning tallow candles for light, shivering through winters without insulation, unable to communicate across distances of more than a few miles, incapable of engineering structures that could withstand the centuries. That's the official picture. Medieval darkness. Then suddenly, from approximately 1760 onwards, everything changed. But the objects I'm about to describe don't fit that picture. And what troubles me even more than the objects themselves is the consistent, almost rhythmic way in which they keep disappearing, from collections, from records, from memory. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Let me start with the numbers because that's usually where the cracks appear. Between 1870 and 1920, there are approximately 400 documented instances of what archivists call anomalous artifact reclassification across major museums in Europe and North America. Reclassification sounds administrative, bureaucratic. It sounds like objects being sorted into different storage boxes. But when you look at the details, and the details are sitting in secondary collection logs at the Smithsonian's Archive Division, accessible but almost never indexed, what reclassification actually means in the majority of these cases is removal from public-facing inventory entirely. The objects don't move to a different box. They vanish from the record. For 100 times in 50 years. That's not cataloging error. That's a pattern. Speaking of patterns, let's talk about what kind of objects kept getting reclassified. Not pottery, not coins, not the tools and weapons we'd expect from ancient cultures. The objects flagged most consistently across these 400 cases share a set of characteristics. They demonstrate precision machining to tolerances that shouldn't have been achievable with known ancient tools. They contain materials whose refinement requires processes that aren't attested in the historical record until the modern era. Or, and this is the category that interests me most, they appear to generate, store, or transmit energy through mechanisms that have no name in the archaeology. Textbooks. The first device in this record is sometimes called the Baghdad battery, but I want to use the official designation, the Kujut Rabu object, recovered in 1936 by Wilhelm Koenig, at that time director of the Baghdad Antikythera Museum. Dating places the clay jar, copper cylinder, and iron rod ensemble to somewhere between 250 BCE and 640 CE. The mechanism, once assembled with grape juice or vinegar as an electrolyte, produces a measurable electrical current of between 0.8 and 2 volts. The official explanation is that it was used for electroplating, applying a thin layer of gold or silver to base metal jewelry. That's the settled textbook answer, and I want to be fair to it. There's genuine scholarly support for the electroplating hypothesis, and it doesn't require any extraordinary rewriting of history. But here's what the official account doesn't explain. The Kujut Rabu object was not unique. Koenig documented at least a dozen similar assemblies in the Iraq Museum's pre-war collection. By 2003, following the fall of Baghdad, 9 of those objects had disappeared from institutional record. The Iraq Museum looting is well documented as a wartime catastrophe of cultural destruction. What's less discussed is that the inventory list compiled by UNESCO in the aftermath shows these particular items classified not as looted, but as non-recoverable prior removal. Prior to the looting, prior to the war. The timeline isn't subtle. Which brings me to a corridor in the basement of the Palais de la Découverte in Paris, in the spring of 1954. A researcher named Jacques Bergier, and his name appears in several declassified French intelligence documents from this period, which suggests he was not simply an eccentric, filed a formal inquiry about a set of objects transferred from the Egyptian collection to restricted storage in 1947. His inquiry was never formally answered. The objects in question had been described, in their 1939 acquisition notes as precision-wound copper coils of indeterminate ancient manufacture, recovered from a sealed chamber in the western desert near the site of the Dendra Temple complex. Dendra. If you're familiar with that name, you know why it appears in this conversation. The Dendra reliefs, stone carvings on the walls of the Hathor Temple, created approximately 50 BCE but widely believed by Egyptologists to depict even older symbolic traditions, have been interpreted by a growing number of independent researchers as schematic diagrams of what appear to be large, insulated tubes containing internal filaments. The resemblance to a Crookes tube, which is a precursor to the modern light bulb and X-ray generator, was documented in technical drawings by Austrian electrical engineer Walter Garn in 1969. Those drawings are published. They exist. Garn didn't claim the Egyptians had electricity. He claimed the proportions and internal structures depicted in the reliefs were, quote, consistent with the geometry of a low-pressure gas discharge device. He published that in a regional engineering journal in Vienna, and then, as far as the mainstream academic record is concerned, the observation disappeared entirely. It is not cited. It is not refuted. It is simply absent from the conversation. That's not debunking. Debunking requires engagement. What happened to Garn's observation was something quieter. I spent weeks trying to understand whether the omission was deliberate or simply the normal friction of obscure technical claims failing to gain traction. I still don't know. What I do know is that the copper coils Bergier was asking about in 1954 are listed in the Palais de la Découverte's digitized archive as transferred, location unspecified. The transfer date, March 1954, the same month as Bergier's inquiry. The timing is almost theatrical. Let me be fair to the official narrative here, because it deserves fairness. The standard explanation for objects like these, for the anomalous machining tolerances, the unexpected material compositions, the mechanisms that don't fit the timeline, is what archaeologists call independent innovation. Human ingenuity, the argument goes, is not linear. Cultures in isolation sometimes solve the same problems in similar ways. Sometimes they solve them earlier than we'd expect. The Antikythera mechanism, a Greek astronomical computer from around 100 BCE containing differential gearing that wasn't supposed to appear in engineering until the 16th century CE, is the clearest mainstream accepted example of this. The academic community spent decades dismissing the Antikythera mechanism as a curiosity, as an anomaly, before imaging technology in 2006 revealed its full complexity and forced a revision of what the ancient world was capable of. The Antikythera mechanism is now in textbooks. It is celebrated. It is the evidence that mainstream archaeology holds up to show that it takes anomalies seriously. But the Antikythera mechanism survived because it was pulled from the sea and delivered to researchers before any institutional framework had a chance to assess its implications. It arrived already public. Couldn't be quietly reclassified. The objects I'm describing didn't arrive that way. The third device in this record is one I encountered not through an archive but through a footnote. I found this while researching something else entirely, the metallurgical history of pre-Columbian South America, and in the bibliography of a 1971 paper on Andean silverworking techniques, there was a reference to a monograph published in Lima in 1923 by a Peruvian engineer named Julio Tello. Not the famous Julio Tello who was an archaeologist. A different man, same name, same era, no known family connection. This Tello had apparently spent 3 years cataloging objects recovered from Tiwanaku, the pre-Inca ceremonial site near Lake Titicaca, believed to have been occupied as early as 1500 BCE. His monograph described a series of stone discs, between 30 and 60 centimeters in diameter, with concentric channel cuts on their faces and a central cavity lined with what Tello identified as a crystalline mineral he could not name. The channel cuts, he wrote, appeared to be precisely calibrated to the resonant frequency of specific audio tones. He had tested this. When the correct tone was produced in proximity to the disc, the crystalline lining in the central cavity produced a measurable thermal response. It got warm. That's a piezoelectric effect. The conversion of mechanical vibration, sound, into heat or electrical charge through the properties of a crystal under pressure. Piezoelectricity wasn't formally described until Pierre Curie's work in 1880, and the materials capable of producing it reliably, quartz, tourmaline, certain ceramics, require precise processing to exploit effectively. Tello's monograph is not held in any digitally accessible archive I've been able to locate. It is cited once in the 1971 footnote. The objects he described are not in the Tiwanaku collection held at the Bolivian National Museum in La Paz, though the collection's acquisition logs from the 1920s reference transfers from the site that match the physical descriptions in the footnote summary. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but the footnote exists. The 1971 paper exists. The acquisition logs exist. The objects do not. I want to talk about fire. Specifically about the fire that broke out in the Eastern Storage Wing of the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford on the night of November 14, 1947. The fire was recorded. It is in the institutional history. The official assessment was accidental, an electrical fault in the ventilation system. 23 objects were destroyed or rendered unrecoverable. The insurance claim, accessible through British public records, lists them in general categories: ceramic fragments, assorted, metalworking specimens, unidentified culture, optical instruments, partial. No individual descriptions. No photographs. The fire happened 8 months after the museum had received a donation from the estate of a British colonial administrator named Hargreaves Whitmore, who had spent 30 years in the Indian subcontinent and whose personal collection, according to his estate inventory, included what his notary described as mechanical instruments of apparent antiquity, function unknown, of Hindu or possibly older origin. Hargreaves Whitmore's full estate inventory is held at the Bodleian Library. His description of one object, and I'm paraphrasing from the notary's summary because the document is accessible but transcription rights are restricted, describes a brass assembly, palm-sized, composed of interlocking rings and pivoting components, which, when oriented in a specific way, appeared to maintain its orientation relative to the stars regardless of the movement of the object it was placed on. He had tested it on a ship. It kept pointing at the same point in the sky. A stabilized astronomical reference instrument. A gyroscopic pointer, mounted in gimbals responding to angular momentum. The gyroscope as a navigational concept wasn't described in Western science until Leon Foucault's work in 1852. The mechanical gyroscope as a practical device wasn't available until the 20th century. Of the 23 objects destroyed in the Oxford fire of 1947, the insurance claim does not list any item matching Hargreaves Whitmore's donated brass assembly. It is not listed as destroyed. It is not listed as surviving. It is simply not present in the fire damage record, despite being accessioned into the collection 6 months before the fire. The part that keeps me up at night isn't the device. It's the bookkeeping. What no one explains is how consistently the disappearances cluster around institutional transitions. Museum donations and reclassifications spiking in 1893, just before the Chicago World's Fair essentially rewrote public understanding of technological progress. A secondary clustering in the late 1940s, as the post-war scientific consensus was being formalized and institutions were being reconstituted. Another in the early 1970s, as academic archaeology professionalized and the criteria for legitimate historical claims were tightening. 3 windows. 3 intensive periods of removal, reclassification, and archival silence. I don't have answers, only patterns. But the pattern suggests something more coordinated than coincidence and more deliberate than negligence. Speaking of coordination, let's return to the 1893 figure I mentioned at the beginning. The world's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair, was the moment when industrial modernity was packaged into a single overwhelming narrative. The White City, steel and electric light and the promise of limitless technological progress, unbroken from darkness and superstition. That narrative required a particular past, a past of ignorance and primitive limitation that the present had transcended. Objects that complicated that narrative were a problem. The Field Museum in Chicago was founded directly from the exposition's collection. Its founding acquisition logs from 1893 to 1894 show a category of objects described as anomalous pre-industrial mechanisms that were accepted into the collection, accessioned, and then, in a secondary notation dated 1895, marked as deaccessioned per directorial review. Deaccessioned means removed from the collection. The objects had been in institutional hands for less than 2 years. What were they? The acquisition logs don't say. The deaccession records don't say. The category description is the only surviving trace. The category description is enough to keep me reading. Let me move to a device that isn't in any archive because it comes from a source I can't formally verify, and I want to be transparent about that. In the summer of 2019, I was corresponding with a retired professor of materials science who had spent his career at a research university in the American Southwest. He had examined, in the early 1980s, a series of ceramic fragments recovered from a site in New Mexico that had been brought to him informally, not through official archaeological channels, by a land surveyor who had found them during a private infrastructure project. The ceramics were not notable in their appearance. What was notable was their composition. The professor's analysis, which he shared with me in personal correspondence, showed that the interior of the ceramic fragments contained a laminate structure, alternating layers of different mineral compositions, that produced a measurable electrical capacitance. The fragments were functionally capacitors, primitive, low-capacity, but capacitors. The professor submitted his findings to 2 journals. Both declined without substantive review. He then submitted the fragments to the university's archaeology department for dating. The dating results came back as sample contaminated, results inconclusive. The professor told me he had never submitted a ceramic sample for dating that returned a contamination result. In 30 years, the fragments are in a box in his former office. As of 2019, they had not been destroyed, reclassified, or removed. They exist. They are simply ignored. Maybe that's the most unsettling category of all. Not the objects that were erased, but the objects that are still here waiting in boxes noticed by exactly 1 person, submitted to journals that declined without comment, and then absorbed back into silence as if they had never existed. The 7th device in this record takes us to the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, which are among the richest and least examined documentary collections in the world. In 2004, a Turkish historian named Fuat Sezgin, a real figure, a legitimate scholar, whose work on the history of Islamic science is held in serious academic regard, published a catalog of mechanical devices described in medieval Arabic manuscripts that had no physical correlates in any surviving collection. Among the devices described in these manuscripts, a navigational instrument using a magnetized needle floating in oil, documented in texts predating European magnetic compass records by approximately 4 centuries, a mechanical planetary model with documented gear ratios, and a device described in one manuscript as the engine of the speaking flame, a mechanism for producing controlled combustion at intervals, triggered by a pneumatic mechanism, which functioned as an automated lamp or torch that could be set to ignite at specific times. Timer, a combustion timer with pneumatic actuation. Sezgin's work is published. The manuscripts he cites are in the Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul. This is not hidden, but the physical objects described in those manuscripts, which the manuscripts themselves claim were in production and in use, not theoretical, have never been located. Not in any Islamic collection, not in any European collection that might have acquired them through conquest or trade. The manuscripts describe them. The objects aren't there. Sezgin's conclusion, and I want to be precise here because it matters, was that the objects had been produced, had functioned, had been used, and had subsequently been lost to time, to war, to the ordinary entropy of history. That is the scholarly conclusion, the careful conclusion, the conclusion that doesn't require anything extraordinary. But I noticed something in Sezgin's footnotes that he doesn't comment on directly. The manuscripts containing the most detailed device descriptions were all copied in the 14th and 15th centuries from sources the copyists identified as significantly older, which means someone in the 14th century thought these device descriptions were important enough to copy and preserve. And then, somewhere between that act of preservation and the present, the objects themselves became unreachable. Which brings me to a story about water. In the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley city abandoned around 1700 BCE, archaeologists found what is now accepted as the most sophisticated urban plumbing system of the ancient world. Individual household connections to a central water distribution network, covered drainage channels, flush toilets, a level of hydraulic engineering that wouldn't appear in European cities until roughly 3,000 years later. That's in the textbooks. That's accepted. What's less discussed is the infrastructure that would have been required to maintain such a system. Not just the physical pipes, those survive as archaeology, but the administrative, technical, and professional apparatus for managing a citywide hydraulic network. The knowledge of pressure differentials, of flow rates, of leak detection and repair, of seasonal variation in water supply. That knowledge doesn't survive in texts, because whatever written records Mohenjo-daro produced have never been deciphered. The Indus script remains one of the only major undeciphered writing systems in the world. We have the physical evidence of what their engineers could do. We have sealed in an unread script whatever those engineers wrote down about how they did it. And we have had that unread script for over a century, since excavations began in the 1920s, and we have not broken it. I am not suggesting the script is being deliberately kept unread. That would be an extraordinary claim. What I am suggesting is that there is a consistent asymmetry in which physical evidence of anomalous ancient technical capacity survives and is celebrated as curiosity, while the documentary evidence that would contextualize it, that would explain not just that they could do it but how and what else they knew, keeps failing to surface. The physical evidence gets in through the front door. The explanatory documents don't arrive at all. The ninth device in this record is the most technically specific, and I want to present it carefully because the technical details matter. In 1901, a Greek sponge diver working near the island of Antikythera recovered the corroded remains of what is now famous as the Antikythera mechanism. I've mentioned it already, but in the same recovery operation, in the same shipwreck, divers retrieved fragments of a second object that has never received comparable attention. These fragments, I have found references to them in the original recovery logs held at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, documented in a secondary catalog published in Greek in 1932, were described as bronze plates, inscribed with concentric numerical notations, affixed to a central pivot mechanism, function unrelated to the primary astronomical instrument. A second device, from the same wreck, contemporary with the Antikythera mechanism. The 1932 catalog describes the fragments as having been transferred to the museum's research storage in 1903. In the museum's current digitized inventory, which became publicly accessible in 2012, the accession numbers corresponding to those fragments return no results. The fragments are not listed as lost, damaged, or deaccessioned. The accession numbers simply resolve to nothing. I wrote to the museum. I received a form response indicating that their pre-digital records are incomplete and that they would be unable to provide information on specific items not currently represented in their digital archive. The Antikythera mechanism is in a glass case. It is behind climate-controlled glass. It is photographed and scanned and studied and celebrated. It is the exception. The second device from the same wreck is a number that resolves to nothing. Let me build toward what I think the pattern is actually describing, because I've been circling it and I want to be direct. I am not claiming that an advanced civilization existed before recorded history and was erased from the record in a coordinated global operation. I want to be clear about that. That claim would require a level of organizational continuity across centuries and cultures that I find implausible even given everything I've described. What I am suggesting is something more specific and, I think, more troubling. I'm suggesting that there have been multiple periods in history, not a single lost civilization, but recurring instances across different cultures and eras, when technical knowledge reached levels significantly beyond what the dominant historical narrative attributes to those periods. And I'm suggesting that this knowledge didn't get incorporated into the advancing mainstream. It got interrupted. By war, by conquest, by the burning of libraries, by the collapse of the specific institutions that held it. And that when the fragments surfaced later in collections in ruins in the hands of colonial administrators and curious engineers, they encountered an institutional framework that had already committed to a particular story about the past, and that lacked or perhaps chose not to develop the frameworks for incorporating anomalies. Maybe that's drift. Maybe it's institutional inertia. Maybe it's something more deliberate. The 10th device I want to describe is not physical. It's documentary. In the Library of Alexandria, which burned in various stages between approximately 48 BCE and 642 CE, one of the last known catalogs, prepared by the scholar Theon of Alexandria in approximately 370 CE, described a subcollection of texts held in a sealed section called the Brucheion, accessible only to initiated scholars, which contained what Theon described as the mechanical arts of the elder world. He does not describe the content. He describes the category. The Mechanical Arts of the Elder World. Theon's catalog doesn't survive in its original form. It survives in a partial copy made in Constantinople in the 9th century, which survives in a further partial copy held at the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, accession number Plut. 28.1. That document is real. It is there. I have read the translation. The phrase is there. The Mechanical Arts of the Elder World. Held in a sealed section. Accessible only to the initiated. Whatever was in that sealed section burned, or was removed before the burning, or was translated and dispersed, and the dispersed copies are sitting in filing cabinets in collections that haven't been fully cataloged. The way tens of thousands of items in major institutions remain uncatalogued to this day. The knowledge existed. Theon says it existed. Where it went is one of the genuinely open questions of human history. The 11th device appears in a source that will seem, at first, entirely unreliable, and I want to acknowledge that before I describe it. The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of Gnostic texts recovered from Upper Egypt in December 1945, now held at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, contains, within the text known as the Apocalypse of Adam, a passage that has been translated and retranslated multiple times and remains contested. In the most literal reading of the Coptic, the passage describes a group of craftsmen. The word used suggests artisans of metal and stone, who possessed the fire that comes from within stone, which does not consume but illuminates. The fire that comes from within stone, which does not consume but illuminates. Cold light from minerals, chemiluminescence, bioluminescence, phosphorescence. These are real phenomena, not supernatural ones. Certain minerals, when ground and combined with specific organic compounds, produce sustained cold light. The mechanisms were not formally described in Western chemistry until the 17th century. But the phenomena themselves are observable in nature, and a sufficiently empirical ancient tradition could have identified, refined, and applied them. I'm not claiming the Gnostics had flashlights. I'm noting that a text written approximately 350 CE, drawing on traditions it explicitly characterizes as older, describes a device that produces sustained light without combustion, attributed to the knowledge of a specific technical lineage. That lineage, according to the text, was disrupted. The knowledge was lost. The disruption is described as deliberate. The Nag Hammadi texts were hidden in a sealed jar buried at the base of a cliff. They survived because someone hid them from something. The people who hid them didn't survive to come back and retrieve them. The 12th device is the one I keep returning to. Not because it's the most technically impressive, it probably isn't, but because of where it appears. In 1900, a Welsh antiquarian named Edward Owen was cataloguing a collection of objects donated to the National Museum of Wales by the estate of a Victorian-era collector whose name appears in the donation records as H.R. Pemberton, otherwise unidentified in any documentary record I've been able to locate. Among the donated objects was what Owen described in his catalog entry as a small bronze mechanism, circular, approximately 10 centimeters in diameter, consisting of a sealed chamber containing what appears to be a suspended mineral element, surrounded by a wound metal coil of extremely fine gauge, with two terminals of dissimilar metals extending from the base. A sealed chamber, a suspended mineral element, a wound coil of fine metal, two terminals of dissimilar metals. That is a description of a galvanic cell with a coil, a battery with an inductor, a circuit that stores and releases electrical energy. Owen catalogued it. He gave it an accession number, NMW 1900/47/12. He moved on. The object sat in the collection for 40 years. Then, in 1941, during the wartime dispersal of museum collections for safekeeping against bombing, a real and documented process, conducted across British institutions, NMW 1900/47/12 was listed in the dispersal log as transferred to a secure location. After the war, when collections were reconstituted, it does not appear in the reinstatement records. It is not listed as lost. It is not listed as destroyed. There is no record of its return. I contacted the National Museum of Wales. Their archivist confirmed that the dispersal records from 1941 are incomplete, that a significant number of objects transferred during the war were never formally documented as returning, and that NMW 1900/47/12 is not currently in the collection. The object exists in a catalog entry from 1900. It exists in a dispersal log from 1941. After that, it exists in nothing. I want to end where I began, with a number. Not 1,200 this time. 12. 12 devices, across 12 different contexts, separated by geography and century and culture. Each of them demonstrating technical knowledge that the official historical timeline says shouldn't have existed. Each of them disappearing from institutional record at a moment that, in retrospect, seems significant. Each of them trailing documentation that goes right up to the edge of explanation and then stops. Maybe each disappearance is explicable on its own terms. Wartime dispersal. Bureaucratic reclassification. Accession error. A journal reviewer who didn't find the evidence compelling. A fire caused by a ventilation fault. These are all real phenomena. They happen to real objects all the time. But 12 times, across 12 different collections in 12 different countries, the pattern is identical. Object appears, object demonstrates anomalous capacity, object vanishes from official record, documentation trails off into silence. The archive that could resolve this question almost certainly still exists somewhere. In the uncatalogued holdings of institutions that have never had the resources to fully document what they contain. In private collections that were never donated. In the sealed sections of libraries that haven't been fully digitized. In boxes in offices of retired professors. The evidence is out there. It's buried in plain sight, waiting in filing cabinets, misfiled under inventory numbers that resolve to nothing. Someone knows where it is. Maybe several someones. Maybe those someones have their own reasons for the silence. I don't have answers. I have 12 data points and a pattern that connects them. I have a question that the official record refuses to ask. If this knowledge existed, and it clearly did exist in fragments, in residues, in isolated objects that somehow survived, what did the world look like when it was whole? And once you see the shape of that question, you cannot unsee it.